You should be, if you're engaged with this process of awakening, if you're engaged with the practice and the teaching, then there should be an ongoing process in which you keep looking and seeing different things. And in this process of looking and seeing different things, there will be things that come up that at first glance appear to be confusing, or appear to not make sense, or appear to be paradoxical. And if you are continuing the process and practicing meditation and doing the learning and paying attention to the teaching, then these things that arise that are confusing will eventually become clear. It's kind of like, it's like an ongoing revelation. You know, the word revelation is based on the word reveal. So it's like an ongoing revealing of the truth, an ongoing revealing of your true nature and how who you really are relates to who you think you are. In the beginning, you often hear teachers say, and you've often heard me say, that you're not who you think you are. So in the beginning, it's a matter of recognizing who you're not, that you thought you were. And then, as you pay attention and out of looking at who you're not, start to get a sense of who you are, which is the most important first step. And this is a step that can't be skipped. You've got to look and you've got to see who's looking. You've got to look and you've got to see who you are. And that seeing of who you are is not a thought, it's not a concept. It's that which is always there, never changes. And so there needs to be a recognition of that, and that recognition has to be one that you have, so that on the authority of your own experience, you have come in contact with the truth of yourself. That's the first step that can't be skipped, because without that, it's just an academic process. Without that, it's just learning concepts and so forth. And as interesting as all that might be, it's not going to get the job done. It's not going to cause the result that is intended. And the result that is intended, which is another important thing for you to be clear about, because you're going to need clarity about that, and you're going to need the recognition of who you are to maintain the motivation in this process, because it's not always an easy ride. It's not always comfortable. A lot of it has to do with facing things that have been ignored, or facing things that you've turned away from. So it's important to understand the need to recognize who you are. And then the step after that that comes is the reverse. The step after that that comes is now what the teaching says is you are who you think you are. And then then you begin to deal with the paradox of the truth. Because if non-duality is a fact, if non-duality is the truth, it means there is not two. There's not the self that you didn't know you were and the person that you thought you were. That's two. There's only one. And if that's the case, it means that although you may recognize the reality of yourself, if you look and you see that which doesn't change and has always been there, but then you have to recognize that who you thought you were, the personality, is that same consciousness, is that same awareness. And thus there is not two. So then it becomes a matter of what some teachers call integration, integrating the experience, so that you are paying attention to who you're being. You're paying attention to who you're being, and you're paying attention to what's happening in terms of whether or not your life is upsetting, in terms of whether or not you're experiencing conflict, in terms of whether or not you're suffering. Because in the context of this process, suffering is presenting you with the opportunity to learn, to see something, to recognize something. Because we teach and hopefully learn the source of the suffering. You know, the source of the suffering is the expectation that things should be other than they are. You know, the idea that how you think things should be has anything to do with reality. And so then we get into the idea of, okay, so if you're paying attention and you're noticing when you're upset and you're noticing when there's suffering present, then the other thing that can be recognized is, okay, so what's going on? See, if you have recognized who you actually are, and so this process has begun, and then you find yourself suffering, if the suffering is presenting you with an opportunity to reconnect with the truth, to see who you are, to see what's actually going on at the time the suffering's occurring, and you know that the source of the suffering is the idea that things should be other than they are, so you're in conflict with what's so, you're in conflict with reality, then the next thing to do is to look and see, okay, how's that work? What's actually happening when I'm in conflict with reality, when I am upset because things aren't the way I think they should be? Well, the answer to that question is in my last statement. Things aren't the way I think they should be. So the suffering occurs when your identification is with thinking. The suffering occurs when your identification is with the mental state in which thoughts are arising and emotions are arising, right? And you're identifying with that, and in the identification with that, you forget who you are, and you're back in the drama, and you're back in the psychodrama, so to speak. You're back in playing out the patterns, the neural patterns. You're back in acting out your history in present time. And that's why I say that it's important to begin to recognize the nature of thought, the nature of thinking. That I have said many times here that it's very important to be clear that a thought is not the truth. A thought is an interpretation. It's a distortion. It's based on past experience. It's based on, it's a fear-based origination. It's insubstantial, right? A thought is insubstantial. In other words, it's not real, has no substance, right? And it's very important to be clear that most of humanity is depending on that which has no substance. It's depending on that which is not real. It's depending on that which is reactionary and fear-based as a source for behavior, because what people think about is what they end up acting on, right? So that's why it's important to get, instead of having to suffer the consequences of actions, to back up to what is happening before the action occurs, which is the thought process, and to start to pay attention to thinking in such a way that you're able to see through the thought. See through the thought. See that the thought is transparent, and be able to, in real time, as the movie is playing, see the movie, instead of being in the movie, you see. That's seeing through the thought. And the practice of seeing through the thought is best done when the thoughts and the emotions are strong, right? So that's where you're being compelled to identify with them, right? That's where you would end up acting the thought and the emotion out. So for example, when you're dealing with relationships with people, and one of the most powerful and useful places to practice what is being taught is in the relationships you have with the people that you're closest to. And so situations are going to occur there in which you will find yourself upset. You will find yourself acting out. You'll find yourself confused. You'll find yourself suffering. And so that becomes the opportunity to, at the time it's occurring, to notice what the thoughts are that you are identifying with in real time, and then look through the thought to what's actually happening. In other words, if you have a situation with a person in your life, whether it be your partner, your children, your parents, and you notice there's an emotional uprising, there's an emotional stimulation, there's a reaction, and there are thoughts that are occurring along with that. For most of humanity, that's the beginning and the end of the story, right? They identify with that, they speak from there, they justify their behaviors, right? And even though they experience negative consequences, right, they rationalize the negative consequences, right? And externalize the source of their suffering. So in this practice, when the thoughts are arising, especially when they're strong emotions, if you look through the thoughts, because they're not real and they're not substantial, and look at what's actually happening so that you can begin to see the difference between what's happening and what you think. See, that's the waking up. Seeing the difference between what's happening and what you think. See the difference between what's happening and what your feelings are about what's happening, so that you can get related to reality, so that you can get related to what's actually happening. Meaning that, for example, in some situation where you find yourself upset, and of course, this can also not just be with other people, but you can be upset with yourself, can't you? Right? So you can practice that too, when you find yourself disturbed by your own behavior, disturbed by your own actions and so forth. You can practice this that way too. To look through the thinking about it to the reality of it, which is who you actually are, right? And who you actually are is where the peace is where the unconditional love is where the innocence is, so that you can let go of the thinking and stop relating to the thinking as if it's reality. And if you can do this in the middle of an upset with people that you're close to and you have emotional connections with, it will be a major breakthrough. It'll be an opportunity for you to have a very powerful experience of the truth. Meaning that in the middle of something that you feel compelled to say or do something, that you see through all that and see what's actually happening, and you don't say or do that thing. And you're able to be present in such a way where you're coming from is not the thinking, you're coming from who you actually are. And when you're coming from who you actually are, you're coming from your heart center. You're not coming from your head. Right? So one of the things that has come up recently in some of my conversations with my clients has to do with the idea that it's easy to come to the conclusion that what we're talking about here in terms of what there is to practice and to learn is to be a certain way. This is very important. It's easy to come up with the conclusion that what we're talking about here and what these practices are about is to be a certain way, to be saintly, right? To be a spiritual person, right? To be a good person, so you never get upset, you're always calm, you know what I mean? No matter what happens. It's easy to come to that conclusion, right? Because that's kind of an image that is popular, that with people about spirituality, that you're going to be saint-like. Nothing's going to ever bother you. But the reality of it is, if that conclusion is made, if you come to that conclusion, you will end up being confused because you'll find yourself suffering. You'll find yourself trying to be a certain way, trying to be calm when you're upset, right? And you'll find yourself suffering. You'll find yourself stuffing your emotions. You'll find yourself behaving in ways that don't produce the results that you would like to have, right? And so it's very important to understand that to be who you are is not to be a certain way. To be who you are is to be present. To be who you are is to be free, to be any way that is appropriate in the situation, right? To express who you are. So where you're coming from is what matters, right? And if you're in a situation where, for example, you experience anger with your partner, or anger with a child, or anger with yourself, right? The freedom to be any way that is appropriate to the situation means that you may express that anger. You may not always be calm, cool, and collective, right? Because that's fixation. You're fixated on a particular way of being, right? This is about being free to express whatever will be workable in the situation, and it's where you're coming from. So there are times, for example, in a parent's relationship to their child, when they're angry and they don't express the anger, they express concern and caring for the child. Out of being present and coming from a heart place, so that's what appears to be the workable way to be. That appears to be the response to what's happening, right? And then in another situation, the child may do something and the anger comes up, and you're present and you're seeing things from a heart center, and you express the anger, right? Because anger can be useful as a way of being, right? Anger can be a useful way of being under certain conditions and in certain situations. It has an impact, right? It has an impact, right? That's why in Zen, one of the Zen masters that I've studied, he would often, in his interactions with people, where they would digress into these stories, right? In conversations with him, they would digress into these stories and digress into these dramas and states of mind and everything. And he would sometimes just say, "Wake up!" And of course, that, did you experience the shock of that?
Yes.
Yeah. And sometimes that's what people need, is a shock. That's what Paul Hederman says with the bitch slap, right? Sometimes people need a shock. But you see, you can't deliver that kind of shock unless you're clear about where you're coming from, right? So you're not attached to it. You're not attached to the outcome of it. You want the impact to occur, and that impact may cause the other person to be upset, right? But this is a conscious thing. This is a responsible thing that you're doing. You want them to be in the upset. You want them to experience the upset. But the point I'm making here is that freedom is the freedom to be whatever way will work to produce the intended result, whether we're talking about you with yourself or you with other people. I took a leadership course with one of my teachers that was like a 6-day course up in Dartmouth University a few years ago. And he was teaching how to be a leader, the being of a leader, right? It was an ontological process, an ontological experience, meaning, because the meaning of ontology is the study of being. And one of the things that was emphasized is to be an effective leader, you have to be free to produce whatever behavior would produce the result that you're out to produce. but not without having a connection to your source. You see what I'm saying? So it's not just like playing a game, right? It's not a mind game, right? It's about being free, but also being connected to your heart center when you're in relationship to people, so that you can be responsible, right? Be responsible, right? And produce results in the moment that can only come from actually being present and connected to the natural state, to yourself. Which means that every moment is new, every moment is different. That's the problem with the idea of being a certain way, or having a strategy, right? Or having a certain way that you do things, right? Is that it's never going to be what works all the time, because situations are never the same, they're always changing. So you have to be able to be present to the uniqueness of the situation, and then be aware of who you are, so that you can come from there and then see through the insubstantial thinking that goes on in your mind, to be present to what's actually happening, right? And then respond. As time passes, if you continue to meditate and learn what there is to learn, as far as having who you actually are be expressed through your personality, right? What I'm talking about will happen on its own, right? It'll happen on its own. To break it down the way I'm breaking it down is just a matter of allowing you to look at what, the process is, what's happening when it happens, right? So that you have some way of approaching it, some way of looking at it, and starting to pay attention in situations where you can exercise the possibility by being aware of your thoughts, seeing through the thoughts, being aware of your emotions, letting them be whatever they are, not trying to control them, not acting them out necessarily, right? And if that's the case, there will naturally be more effectiveness, there'll be more flow, there'll be more of the results that you intend to produce. In these practices, in Buddhism, for example, I remember when I went to the Vipassana training for meditation, they start out with the idea that as a baseline from which you can begin to do these practices and practice these teachings, there's a baseline of behavior, moral behavior, right? So they said, for example, in this Vipassana training, before you start to be trained in this form of meditation, you need to agree with these behavioral this behavioral baseline. Do no harm, right? So this is one of the ways that you can put yourself in the process of paying attention and noticing what's going on, if your commitment is to do no harm, so that you continue to look at what's happening in terms of will this produce harm? And so you agree to a lot of different things in a lot of these retreats and practices. Do no harm, obviously don't physically hurt anybody, don't abuse anybody sexually, and on and on and on. But these are all things that are really aspects of your natural state. So there is a transition that happens where, instead of having to obey the 10 Commandments, if you want to talk about it in a Christian context, instead of having to obey the 10 Commandments and be forgiven for your sins, right? Or instead of having to follow some moral compass, right? That you find yourself naturally behaving consistent with these ideas of morality. It just becomes who you are, instead of something that you're obeying. You follow what I'm saying? That's what keeps most of humanity under control, is their fear of violating things that will send them to hell. But if you wake up, that's no longer the case. You're not behaving in your fear of violating what will send you to hell. you're behaving simply out of unconditional love. You're behaving out of a natural morality instead of a morality that is a set of laws that you're following. And that set of laws that people follow keeps the personality alive, you know, because the personality, by its very nature, is unstable, right? So if you know you're unstable, then you better have some rules that you're following to stay out of trouble, right? Okay, so I tried to go over some things tonight with you that can open up things a little bit, maybe, in terms of the practice, because if you're on board with what's going on here, then you should wake up in the morning with the awareness channel turned on, right? So that as you go through the day, you're paying attention to what's happening with you energetically, you're paying attention to what's happening mentally in the thought process, and you're making distinctions as you go through the day about where you're coming from. You know, when are you coming from the reactions and your states of mind and your emotions, and when are you coming from your heart? When are you coming from your consciousness and your awareness? Okay, so I'll let you get back to the news.